Years after her daughter left for college, Renata Voss still refilled a prescription that had never once been taken. The label said Chloe's name. Chloe hadn't lived in that house since she was 17. The house on Larkspur Lane looked exactly the way it had for the 11 years Chloe grew up sick. Sick with something nobody could ever quite name, cycling through specialists, elimination diets, 3 different pediatric neurologists, a folder of test results 2 inches thick that never once produced an actual diagnosis. Chloe remembers the taste of a dozen different medications before she was old enough to read their names. She remembers her mother's hand on her forehead every morning before school, checking for a fever that was somehow always faintly there. "You're my little fighter," Renata used to say, brushing Chloe's hair back, voice thick with a tenderness that always arrived heaviest right before a school event Chloe was suddenly too unwell to attend. "Nobody understands what you go through except me." By 12, Chloe had missed more school than she'd attended. By 14, she'd been pulled from soccer, from choir, from a sleepover birthday party she'd cried about for a week. Each time, her mother's explanation was gentle, reasonable, unshakably certain. Chloe's body couldn't handle the stress, the exposure, the exertion. Renata always seemed to know, with a specificity that felt like love, exactly what Chloe's body could and couldn't survive. "She's a very devoted mother," the specialists always said, in the careful tone doctors use when a case defies explanation, and devotion is the only variable they can actually measure. Renata brought binders. Renata tracked symptoms hourly. Renata never missed an appointment, and always had a theory ready before the doctor did. It was a Tuesday in October, the fall Chloe turned 17, when a new pediatrician, young, recently transferred, unfamiliar with the family's long history, did something none of the previous 6 doctors had thought to do. She asked to speak with Chloe alone. "Just for a few minutes," Dr. Anholt said, professionally pleasant, glancing at Renata. Standard practice with teenage patients. Renata's smile flickered just slightly before she agreed. Alone in the room, Dr. Anholt asked Chloe a question nobody had ever asked her directly. "When you're not with your mother, at school, at a friend's house, do your symptoms ever go away?" Chloe opened her mouth to answer the way she always did. And then, for the first time in 17 years, she actually thought about it. They didn't. Not once. Not ever in 17 years had Chloe felt sick anywhere her mother wasn't also present. That single question cracked something open that took 4 more months, 3 specialists, and 1 very quiet hospital admission to fully confirm, an admission where, for the first time, Chloe was kept overnight without her mother present, under careful, unremarked-upon monitoring. She had no symptoms that entire night. None, not one. The diagnosis that followed wasn't for Chloe. It was for Renata, a name Chloe wouldn't learn until she was 23, sitting in a different doctor's office entirely, being told gently that her mother's pattern had a clinical name, and that Chloe herself had likely been its subject for the better part of a decade. Renata never confessed to anything. When Child Protective Services became briefly involved that year, following the hospital's mandated report, Renata was calm, articulate, devastated, a mother wrongly suspected, grieving a system that couldn't understand a sick child's needs. The investigation, without a confession and without physical evidence of harm beyond a decade of unnecessary medications, closed without charges. Chloe was placed with her aunt for the remainder of her minor years. She didn't see her mother again until she was 22, and even then, only once, briefly, at a cousin's wedding, where Renata approached her with tears already prepared, already falling, already performing a grief so convincing that half the family in earshot turned to comfort her instead of Chloe. "You were my whole world," Renata said, loud enough for the room. "I don't know why you'd let anyone convince you otherwise." Chloe said nothing. She'd learned by then that nothing she said in that moment would matter more than the tears already doing the talking for her mother. She thought that was the end of it. The quiet, unresolved kind of ending most families like hers actually get. No trial, no consequence, just distance, and a diagnosis with a name she'd spend years learning to say out loud in therapy, Munchausen by proxy. 6 years later, an old family friend, someone who drifted out of contact after Chloe was removed from the home, reached out with something that changed the shape of the story entirely. Renata had a new child in her life, not her own, a niece, 8 years old, whose parents had recently moved in next door to Renata for support, the way family sometimes does. The friend had noticed, cautiously, carefully, a pattern of symptoms in the little girl that felt uncomfortably, specifically familiar. I didn't know if it was my place to say anything, the friend wrote, but I remembered what happened with you, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. Chloe sat with that message for 3 days before she did anything. She thought about the version of her that had spent a decade believing her own body was broken. She thought about a little girl who might currently be living inside that exact same lie, too young to know there was any other way a body could feel. This time, Chloe didn't stay silent, and she didn't wait for a system to fail the way it had failed her the first time. She spent 2 months building something she'd never had the first time around, a documented, dated, professionally reviewed account of her own decade of unnecessary treatment. Cross-referenced against old medical records she requested from every specialist who'd ever seen her as a child, alongside a formal statement from Dr. Anholt, now retired, but still willing to put her original clinical suspicion in writing. She didn't send it to her mother. She sent it, with the niece's parents' knowledge and consent, directly to the state's Adult and Child Protective Services Division, attached to a formal report specifically flagging the risk pattern now repeating in a second child, 17 years after the first. The investigation this time didn't rely on a confession. It relied on a paper trail 17 years in the making, built by someone who'd finally learned, the hard way, exactly what kind of documentation her mother's charm could never talk its way around. Renata lost supervised access to her niece within the year. She never faced criminal charges. The pattern was, by design, nearly impossible to prosecute cleanly, but the structural consequence landed anyway. A formal record now existed, permanently, flagging the pattern for any future medical provider, any future family member, any future child who ever came near her again. Chloe didn't attend the hearing. He didn't need to hear her mother's voice explain, one more time, how devoted she'd always been. She simply sent one message to the friend who'd first reached out, the only person who'd ever noticed the pattern before it was too late for someone else. Thank you for not staying quiet. I spent 17 years being the only one who noticed something was wrong, and nobody believed me until I was old enough to prove it. That little girl doesn't have to wait that long. Not because of you. She never spoke to her mother again. She didn't need a confrontation, an apology, or a final confession to close the loop this time. The paperwork had already said everything that needed saying.